So just to give a brief introduction about our presenters today, first of all, we have Jean Hornsby, who's an engineering director at Fenstermaker and Associates. She has extensive water resources experience throughout Louisiana and has been involved with this project since its inception. She'll be leading us throughout the majority of this presentation. We also have Anna Ducey with us today, she is an engineering manager at Fenstermaker and Associates as well. She is the deputy project manager for this project and will be presenting a couple portions throughout this webinar. At this point, I'll turn it over to Jean and she'll get us started.
Thank you, Raul. As he mentioned, I'd like to welcome everyone to our final webinar on projects as part of the Let's Talk Drainage webinar series. A couple of things before we get started is we appreciate everyone for attending today, and we apologize for our delay from last week. Apparently, COVID and strep hit our office, so we appreciate everyone's attendance and for participating in our webinar series. In addition, we will not have a web camera this time due to Wi-Fi connections. So a couple of just housekeeping things. But we do welcome everyone, and as we get started, we're first going to hear a brief message from Terry Freelow with the Calcasieu Parish Police Jury Public Works Department.
Good morning, and welcome to our fourth and final webinar of our four-part webinar series, Let's Talk Drainage. Hi, I'm Terry Freelow, Assistant Director of Public Works for Calcasieu Parish and the Project Manager for the Regional Watershed Study. If you have attended any of the previous webinars, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, I hope that you find this format convenient for those who would like to participate in Calcasieu Parish long-term drainage plan. The focus on today's webinar is capital project. Like the Belfield drainage lateral, which was constructed several years ago, it was constructed with a bench cut cross-section which was used to increase storage and flow capacity. Structure mitigation projects can range from local culvert upgrades to channel modification projects or to regional projects like installing a floodgate in the Calcasieu Ship Channel that will help minimize inland flooding during major storm events. However, no one structure or project can solve the drainage issues in Calcasieu Parish. You would have to use a combination of both structure and non-structure or multiple structure projects to help drainage issues. I would like to encourage you to participate in today's webinar with the online chat during the webinar and ask any question you like, or with our online survey after the webinar. This survey will help us answer your specific question pertaining to capital project and will be used in a long-term strategy plan for drainage in Calcasieu Parish. I'd like to give thanks to Calcasieu Parish Police Jurors, our administration staff, and our Director of Public Works, Alan Wainwright, for entrusting me with this project. I also like to thank our engineering consultant, Fenstermaker, and project manager, John Hornsby, and her staff for helping us both with the study and with the webinar series. I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Terry. As Raul mentioned, we'll once again be using Poll Everywhere to gather information throughout this webinar, as well as to ask various questions and participation. You can join via app, webpage, or through text message. So we'll give everybody just a few minutes to go ahead and sign up to be able to participate throughout this. Also, as a reminder of what Terry said, you can input any questions you have throughout the webinar using the chat function as part of the Teams. So let's go ahead and get started. From the beginning, we've discussed what watershed management is, and that there's three main components that make up watershed management: policy, programs, and projects. In our prior webinars, we've gone into detail talking about policy and programs, and today we're going to focus on projects. A project is defined as an individual or collaborative enterprise that is carefully planned to achieve a particular aim. So it's a lot of fancy language, but we all know what a project is. It's really anything that we might construct. Terry used the example of Belfield Ditch. You might also think about detention ponds or floodgates. We're going to talk about a lot of different types of projects that can be implemented and what their impacts are, but they all have the same aim. We're aiming to reduce flooding within Calcasieu Parish. And so these are all flood mitigation projects. Within this webinar, we're going to cover a variety of topics. We're going to start off by talking about what do the models actually provide. You've heard about the models in previous webinars, and today we're going to discuss what these models what they can provide and how they can be used moving forward. We're going to talk about the Calcasieu Parish watersheds and some of its characteristics that make up these watersheds and how these help us drive decision making within individual watersheds. Anna is going to talk about types of projects as well as go over our project evaluation process. Lastly, I'll be presenting a sample of project results. And then finally, we're going to summarize both this webinar as well as our webinar series and talk about some of the next steps moving forward. So what do the models provide? We're going to start off by talking about what exactly is a model. A model is something that we set up and we can utilize as a hydraulic model. It can simulate rainfall, runoff, and flow to predict the extent of water levels or even the depth of flooding. Really, these models help us tell the story of what happens, and we can run a variety of scenarios, a lot of what-if situations. So what happens if the Calcasieu River is really high and we get a 100-year flood event? What happens if the Calcasieu River is low and we get that same event? What happens if we get back-to-back storm events? How does our system react to that? How do the systems react with each other? And we can also start looking and answering other questions. But really, the models are a toolkit. They're tools for us to help tell the complete story of how modeling is working. So what are some of the benefits of these models? Well, a couple of things is, one, it helps us determine our complete flood risk. We've talked about this in prior webinars and why knowing our flood risk is so important. It helps drive policy decisions, and it helps us look at things to make sure that we protect the people, not just those that live here currently, but as we go forward and make decisions of growth and development. So these models can help answer some of those questions. In addition, it can help us evaluate things. Not only do we look at what are the characteristics and how are we flooding today, but what could our future look like? Yes, we do not know what our future holds, but we have enough data to back up some things to allow us to run these what-ifs. What happens if sea level increases by a foot, by 2 feet? What happens if our rainfall continues to get more intense and more frequent? What happens if we continue to develop? All of these what-ifs can be answered by utilizing these models. In addition, we can use the models as a tool to look at flood mitigation projects and also policy improvements. We want to ensure that the project that we implement doesn't have a negative impact downstream. We also want to look and ensure that that project that we implement has a long life and something that can withstand change and adaptation. So these are all important. In addition, the models can also be used to update FEMA flood risk maps so that we understand what our full risk is. So these are all important elements of how these models can be utilized. Next, we're going to hear a short message from Dr. Ehab Maselli. Some of you may be familiar with Dr. Maselli as he has worked his entire career across the Louisiana coast. Specifically, he has worked in Southwest Louisiana and has developed models that have been implemented as part of the Southwest Coastal Study, as well as the Coastal Master Plan. He has also worked the majority of his career here in Calcasieu Parish as well, helping guide us into developing some of the first models that Calcasieu Parish had at hand, and also helping guide decision-making along the way. So at this time, we can go ahead and hear a brief message from Dr. Maselli.
Computer models, they are a tool. They are a vehicle for us to evaluate projects. In and themselves, they are not the ultimate goal, but rather they help us to make better decisions. I'm Ehab Maselli. I'm a civil and environmental engineer with a focus on water resources, currently a faculty at the Department of River Coastal Science and Engineering at Tulane University at the School of Science and Engineering. So I spent my entire career developing and applying computer models to a variety of engineering applications. The way I view computer models is they are an engineering tool that provide us with quantitative insights about the projects that we are trying to implement. They are very visual, so they are an excellent communication tools between disciplines and between engineers and researchers and decision makers. The way we educate the new generations of engineers and scientists who are planning to work in the area of water in the broader sense. It is important to emphasize more than just the technical details. It is important for them to receive the technical competencies and implement that in their work after graduation, but it's important for them to realize the other disciplines that are interacting with engineers. It's important for them to work with environmentalists. It's important for them to work with economists, social scientists, because engineering projects now have broader implications on society that goes beyond the engineering discipline itself. In order for us to actually help communities to become more resilient in the face of natural hazards, rainfall events, hurricane events, we do need to actually have a set of projects that can help the community to be more resilient in facing these natural disasters. It comes and it starts with policies through the ordinance that cities and towns and communities implement. Models play an important role to actually help the decision makers to actually write down or implement these better ordinance. So models have the ability to provide us what the short-term performance of a particular project or suite of projects. Are they going to be meeting these objectives in the next season and in the next year? But they also have the ability to tell us and give us some information about how will they perform 10 years from now, 5 decades from now. And that longevity is important so that we can make the proper investments, or at least to plan ahead that the performance will decline perhaps after a certain period of time, and maybe we can develop some ideas how can we actually enhance or beef up that performance down the line, because we know that it's going to decline down the road at some point. You can see that the role of the models is very critical so that you can actually implement. Number one, we can improve the way we plan for projects so that we can look at cumulative impacts over time. Sometimes when you evaluate individual projects, every individual project might be okay, but collectively they may not be good for the community at large, because they may be taking away space from the floodplains. They may be inducing flooding as a collective set of projects. Oftentimes, the project that we implement have ramifications on people who live downstream of us and people who live upstream of us. And that's why it's very important to actually have collaborative relationships with other jurisdictions that are neighboring to ourselves, whether they are to the east or west or upstream or downstream from us. Oftentimes, sometimes the solution to our problem may actually exist outside of our boundaries. So it is important to actually have that collaborative spirit, because together or jointly we can implement more effective projects that can be for the overall good. It can actually help the entire region. Sometimes the solutions that we will come up with require a level of compromise. It is not easy or possible to always find solutions that are silver bullets and meet all the objectives across the board. So that's where it becomes very important to understand what is the compromise that we are pursuing. And is that compromise going to be acceptable to the community? Is that going to be acceptable because they are the most important people. That's the community themselves. They have to live with the ramifications of projects, not the engineers who are designing them, not the construction companies that build a project, but the community.
Thank you, Ehab. As you mentioned, it's really important that we look at projects and we also think collaboratively, not just of those project impacts, but other pieces as well. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the models in a bit, but first we'd like to know, what projects do these models evaluate? When we talk about the Calcasieu Parish models, do you think that these models are meant to size your driveway culvert? Will they be able to be used to look at a floodgate in the Calcasieu River, maybe a detention pond on your empty lot in your neighborhood, or why subsurface drainage floods downtown? So what are some of the elements what is the most specific element that we'll be able to utilize these models for? See, those numbers are still moving around a little bit, so I'll give it a couple of seconds longer. All right, so looks like things are still jumping around. Okay, so it looks like majority of the group believes that these models will be used to determine if a floodgate on the Calcasieu River can be utilized. The correct answer is actually C. And I'm going to explain that in a little more detail, and we'll tell you which models will be able to look at floodgates on the Calcasieu River itself. So the models that are generated are meant to answer a particular question or to be utilized as a tool. So different models are set up to answer different types of questions. You've heard us talk about the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. The Louisiana Watershed Initiative is a regional watershed level. The models that are being generated underneath this program are going to look at watersheds from what's called a HUC 8 level. So this is a larger scale. And what these are going to do is these types of models will include the Calcasieu River, and they'll include the Sabine River. So the main rivers, they're also going to include some of the tributaries that are coming into those rivers. And their purpose will be to look at more regional scale projects, large things like floodgates on the Calcasieu River, changes in operation along the Sabine River. So looking at these larger scale questions can be answered using these more regional projects. As Ehab said, looking outside your boundaries, looking at how multi-parish jurisdictions work together and looking at these bigger scale projects. Those are going to get covered under the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. The Calcasieu Parish models are being set up at a finer resolution. So they're going to be looking at what we call a HUC 10 or a HUC 12 level. So to give you an idea, all of the watersheds within Calcasieu Parish, our 12 watersheds, all would fit into one HUC 8 watershed on the Louisiana watershed side. The channels that are being studied as part of the Calcasieu Parish Watershed Master Plan include all of your laterals and streams. All of the laterals and streams that drain into the Calcasieu River or into the Sabine River. These models can also be broken down to a finer level and look at smaller projects that might be, a localized detention pond that's anywhere from 10 to 20 acres or a local development. These models can be used for that. Specifically, what we're doing as part of this master plan is we're using these models to look at medium scale projects. So for example, maybe a 20, 50, or 100 acre detention pond, pumps and floodgates. These models are looking at what we're going to call regional projects on the scale of Calcasieu Parish. So we wanted to show this because we want to give you an idea of what these models can be used for, as well as like what we're covering under this watershed master plan. So there's lots of uses for these models going forward, but specifically today and as part of this study, we're going to be looking at those medium scale regional projects to Calcasieu Parish itself. Next, we're going to talk about the Calcasieu Parish watersheds, and we're going to talk about some of their characteristics. So Calcasieu Parish is part of three main watersheds. You've got the Sabine River, the Calcasieu River, and the Mermentau River watershed. The Sabine River is one of our largest ones. It starts all the way up near Dallas and drains all the way through the Toledo Bend Reservoir, through the Sabine River, going through Calcasieu Parish and all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. The Calcasieu River starts all the way up at Fort Polk with Whiskey Chitta and the upper Calcasieu regions and comes all the way down through the main part of Calcasieu Parish and out through into the Gulf of Mexico. And lastly, we've got the Mermentau watershed. Part of this, we've got the Lac Cassine Bayou area that drains into that Mermentau watershed. This area goes down into the GIWW, the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, and actually goes south through a lot of control structures and locks. So we're going to talk specifically about some of these areas, and we're going to break them out and tell you a little bit of the characteristics. We are going to talk about the characteristics of these watersheds because it is important because these can help drive our decision making and looking at what types of projects work. And we want you to get an understanding of why some projects might be beneficial in one location in our parish, but not beneficial in another. So we're going to start off with the Calcasieu River Basin, and we're going to look at the east side of that Calcasieu River. This area includes English Bayou, Cayuchi Coulee, Lake Charles, Prion Lake, and the South Ward 3 areas. Within these watersheds is the city of Lake Charles and the town of Iowa. So on the left side, you can see some socioeconomic as well as environmental impacts that kind of impact these types of watersheds. So sea level rise really impacts all of these watersheds with the exception of Cayuchi Coulee. The reason behind that is because Cayuchi Coulee does have pump stations and a gate structure there that helps control this. But all of these watersheds are subjected to increased rainfall intensity, which we've talked about in prior webinars, as well as increasing in development. Taking it a step further, we're going to start looking at some of the characteristics of these watersheds. What you're going to see on the screen is the elevation changes. This is LIDAR, so anything red or high elevations, anything blue is lower elevations. One thing to note with the east side of the Calcasieu River is that all of these watersheds, although studied individually, they all still have some type of interaction and connection, which is important to note. And we saw that during Hurricane Delta and also the May 2021 event. So although they're standalone and were studied by themselves, they do interact. What you can see here are various characteristics of each one of these watersheds. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that I want you to think about as we're going forward. So one is the amount of development. The Lake Charles watershed is our most heavily developed watershed with 84% developed. Not much within this watershed is left to be developed, with vegetation covering only 9%. But a large amount of our buildings fall within this watershed. And interestingly, only 1% of all of our laterals within Calcasieu Parish is within this watershed as well. So you've got your most heavily populated area draining into really a very small system. Another thing to note is both Prion Lake and Cayuchi Coulee have around 40 to 50% development area, and they're continuing to grow. Other things is Fort 3 and English Bayou, although they have the same amount of buildings located in them as Prion Lake, they're much larger, and both have a large amount of cropland within their area as well. Going on to the west side of the Calcasieu River, we have the Houston River watershed, Ward 1, Vinton, Shoepick, and the Sulphur watersheds. Within these watersheds, DeQuincy falls in Houston River. Vinton, of course, falls into the Vinton watershed. And within the Sulphur watersheds, we have the city of Westlake as well as the city of Sulphur. I'd like to also mention that within Ward 1 is the Moss Bluff area, which is a growing and populated area as well. You can also tell that on the left-hand side, again, all of the factors, sea level rise, increased rainfall, and development all impact these areas. Looking at some characteristics a little bit further, again, you'll once again see the LIDAR within these individual watersheds, red being high elevation, blue being low. A couple of key factors to note here is that the Vinton and Shoepick area are highly volatile to things like tidal as well as surge, being with the low-lying areas at the bottom of it. Another thing to note is that Houston River is our largest watershed. It encompasses basically 25% of all of the parish's drainage channels are within this one watershed itself. Something interesting to note is that on the west side, you've got a lot of forested area. And from a hydrology standpoint, a forested area is really good for drainage because it slows that water down. So a couple of things, when it rains, it's got the trees and the canopy, so it infiltrates a lot of this water. And that undergrowth and vegetation really slows that water down before it gets to your outfall. So forested area is actually good for those living in developed areas because it does slow it down. So changes to that forested area could highly impact how that runoff is getting to its outfall. Again, also note in the Sulphur watershed, we do have a lot of developed area with over 54% being developed in this area and roughly 17,000 buildings. Next, we're going to jump to both the west and the east side of the parish. As I mentioned earlier, you have the Sabine watershed all the way to the west and the Lockasine to the east. All of these are controlled by and are influenced by things like sea level rise, that increased rainfall, and somewhat development. But I'll tell you, these two watersheds are the least amount developed in comparison to some of the other watersheds we mentioned earlier, with only 3% being developed. On the west side for the Sabine Watershed, we've got a lot of forested area. And again, I've talked about that forested area earlier. But there's other things that are going on within the Sabine Watershed. One, it encompasses both the Louisiana and the Texas side. It also gets water that's released from the Salia Bend Reservoir, sometimes even overtopping I-10 and causing closures. A big focus of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative is the studying of the Sabine River and looking at these types of things within it. Looking at some alternatives that we've kind of screened through with various projects. We've noted that policy, as well as looking at development within it, is extremely important for these types of areas. On the Lockasine side, this is heavily drawn by crops, and this area as well will be studied in more detail and when projects being looked at when the Mermentau watershed is looked at as a whole. But this area too should be, we're looking at more non-structural elements within these areas to try and limit any future flooding impacts. At this time, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Anna, and she will talk to you a little bit about types of projects. So diving right into what types of projects these models are used to evaluate. I want to reiterate from previous webinars that it takes the combination of all structural and non-structural solutions working together for flood mitigation. While we are evaluating the typical channel improvement projects, as well as regional detention, I also want to mention that we are looking into things like floodplain preservation projects as well. This is for us to pinpoint if maybe Calcasieu Parish should be purchasing drainage easements or properties that would drastically affect flooding within an area. So before we get into the types of projects, we want to hear from you. What types of projects would you like to see in your area? And this is a poll question where you can select up to 3 choices. We've got a couple of answers coming in now, and it looks like we've got a good variety of projects as well. So we're actually going to be going over quite a few of these as we continue the presentation. It seems channel improvements are the most popular. Now, the main projects we've been evaluating in the parish are the projects you see here: regional detention, pumps and floodgates, channel improvements, roadway elevation projects, floodplain preservation, as well as flow diversion. We've included the average cost and impact on the flooding area to summarize these types of projects. The downward arrows represent the reduction in flooding within the vicinity of the project. For instance, pumps and floodgates have the greatest reduction in flooding. However, they are also the most expensive type of project. We've actually evaluated this type of project in half of the watersheds within Calcasieu Parish. Regional detention is also one of the more common types of projects evaluated. And that's because regional detention can be in a sweet spot a lot of times as far as the cost of the project for the benefits that you get. Lastly, I'll point out roadway elevation projects. If a crossing is constantly flooded, that can make it impassable for emergency vehicles and can make evacuations difficult. This makes roadway elevation projects necessary, but you'll also see that these projects can be the hardest to prove the benefits for the cost. We'll go over some of the results we're seeing later in the presentation, but this is to give you an idea of what types of projects we're looking into as we move through this process. And with the start of the project evaluation, the pilot study evaluated the Lake Charles watershed utilizing the Dapp analysis method. This method comes from Deltares, who are based out of the Netherlands and have been part of this team from the beginning. Dapp stands for Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathways. To provide a brief explanation of what you're seeing on the screen, you'll notice on the left are types of projects, both structural and non-structural. Across the bottom, it's looking at the life of the project in respect to sea level rise. The different colored pathway bars you see going across are the duration or the life of the project. Looking at this, you can see that the non-structural projects on the bottom of the pathway map were more effective than the structural projects for this area. This reflects the biggest takeaway from the Dapp analysis. And this is why we put emphasis on the policy and programs in the last two webinars. It's going to take a combination of policy and programs just as much as it will require projects to address flooding. This Dapp analysis really helped guide the rest of the project evaluation process for the remaining watersheds. And now we're going to highlight a couple of types of projects before we move into the process. So I know when we say detention, what pops into everyone's mind is the typical development detention pond with maybe the feature of a fountain in the center. But that doesn't always have to be the case. On the left side of the screen, you'll see a project in downtown Lafayette where the city, in an effort to reduce flooding downtown, created a subsurface detention area. The top photo is from during construction, and the bottom is after construction was complete. This is a nice green space in the downtown area, but subsurface detention can also exist under a playground or even a parking lot. On the right of the screen are projects that more closely reflect the typical detention pond. The top image represents how detention ponds can really be a community aspect and can increase the quality of life within the area of the pond. You could stock the pond for fishing. You could incorporate a dog park. There could even be walking trails for exercising around the pond. All of these items can be considered benefits of regional detention that aren't typically considered. The bottom right picture is of a bioretention area. Instead of having a raised median along this boulevard, the median is recessed. The typical boulevard project would have runoff draining down from the median onto the roadway and into a subsurface drainage system. This image shows the opposite, where the roadway runoff drains into the median and into the bioretention area. In rain events, this can act as detention to provide flooding relief. And it also serves to benefit the water quality as well. So you've got a lot of options as you move forward with the design and construction of these projects. The next project we're going to highlight is floodgates and pump stations. So when evaluating projects in Calcasieu Parish, we chose to evaluate the floodgates and pump stations as a combination project. So anytime we evaluated these, they were being utilized in conjunction with one another. It's also important to note that these projects were evaluated along the laterals within the parish, like Contraband Bayou, and not the Calcasieu River itself. The image on the right details a scenario of just a floodgate project with no pump station. You can see on a typical day, the gates are left open so that drainage functions as normal. And in high tide or storm scenarios, the floodgates close to prevent backwater flooding. By us analyzing these floodgates in combination with a pump station, we're analyzing the gates open on a normal typical day, with the gates closed in a storm event, and the pumps would function to get the water from the upstream developed area to the downstream end, like Calcasieu River. The left image shows a combination of floodgates and pump station in New Orleans, with the gates being on the left of the image and the pump station on the right. And now that we've highlighted what projects we're assessing, we'll walk through where we are in the evaluation process and what's been done so far. We're currently in phase 1 of project screening or vetting. We started with a very long list of projects and began to eliminate projects from that list by looking at estimated construction cost and scope. For example, a lot of the smaller channel improvement projects can be done by the gravity drainage districts, so we were able to eliminate a lot of those. Then the process required a closer look at repetitive losses and prioritizing projects in those areas. From there, we screened for any major conflicts in an area, such as if a pipeline were going through the middle of a property we'd like to evaluate detention on. Another part of phase 1 is the BCA preliminary screening. BCA is a benefit cost analysis, and it's a requirement to receive funding. This is something taken into consideration when prioritizing projects as well. In order to get a good benefit-cost ratio, the reduction in damages or benefit of a project must outweigh the cost of a project. In working closely with Calcasieu Parish Public Works and Engineering Department, the list of projects was prioritized. When evaluating a project, try to keep in mind that you will almost never input a project into the model, hit run, and have great results. These project evaluations require several iterations to try and maximize the benefit while also limiting the cost. Throw into the mix that a model on average takes 4 to 6 hours to complete a run, and this can be a very time-consuming project evaluation process. Currently, we're doing enough iterations to determine if a project should move to the next phase, phase 2, which is a feasibility study. Calcasieu Parish is currently budgeting to complete these feasibility studies on the projects selected for this next fiscal year. After that's completed, these projects will move forward into phase 3 and 4, which is design and construction. This map shows the types of projects we're analyzing in each watershed. A larger icon on the map represents either a large project area being considered or a cluster of similar projects being evaluated in that area. There are a couple of things you can take away from this map. As you can see, a lot of the detention being evaluated is in the more upstream watersheds. This is due to detention in the downstream watersheds not having as great of an impact. Another thing you might notice is in Lake Charles, we're not evaluating a lot of channel improvement projects. This is because developments were built right on the channel in this area, and there's not a lot of room to widen or improve channels in that watershed. For the more rural watersheds, you won't find as many projects being evaluated. This is due to the BCA requirement. When a watershed doesn't have a lot of development, the amount of damages to start with is limited. So the benefits shown from any project in those areas are typically a lot lower than a more urban watershed. As we're moving on to project results, I want to mention that we're evaluating the top 4 to 6 projects in each watershed. Although you'll see today only a snapshot of some of the results, we have probably 45 more projects that have been analyzed or are currently being analyzed. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jean to go over project results with you. Thank you, Anna. As Anna mentioned, we started off with a large list of projects. These came from stakeholders, they came from working with the parish, and some were even identified by our modelers. That list got kind of shortened to look at projects based on things like repetitive loss or large areas where we saw flooding. And then taking that list a little bit further down, we're now analyzing about 45 projects, and you're going to see a snapshot. We picked both some projects that show benefit as well as some that do not, so that you can get an idea of what we're seeing. What you have in front of you is a dashboard. This is a way for the parish to view the results from the various projects that are being ran. So I'm going to walk you through this dashboard first, and then we're going to dive into some of the results that the model is generating. So to start off, on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the watershed. This is the Lake Charles watershed, and the red star represents the location of the project that we were looking at. Also included, the blue number is the reduction in damages. So you heard Anna mention benefit cost analysis and things like that. For the screening purpose, which is the phase that we're at right now, we looked at one event. We looked at the 100-year event that produced the largest amount of flooding, and we were able to determine the amount of damages that would be incurred due to that storm event. This takes into account a lot of variables through housing prices, elevation of homes, depth of flooding, things like that. But we're able to analyze for both preconditions, the red numbers, as well as the post conditions with the project in place, the damages that would be incurred due to that event, the number of acres that flooded, as well as the number of structures that would be flooded. which you see in the map with the red and green dots. All of the red dots represent structures that would no longer flood after the project is in place, and the green represents the homes that would still flood once the project is in place. Another thing that we have, and I'm going to go ahead and get it running, and I'll continue to talk because of the delay. On the right-hand side, you'll see a animation. So what this is it is a fly-through of the model results. So the light blue represents the pre-condition flood extents, and the blue represents the post-condition flood extents. And all of this information can be viewed for each alternative that we've ran. So you'll be able to select the watershed, you'll be able to select the project, and view kind of different characteristics that were brought out from that model. So the project that you're looking at on the screen right now is in the Lake Charles watershed, and it is pumps and gates. So what we did is we identified a location for this downstream as possible along Contraband Bayou, and we implemented a pumps and gate system. It also includes a boat bay because this is a navigable waterway, and it also included some bulkheading and protection. At this phase, we've also taken a stab at kind of what the land cost would be. We've taken getting an idea of what are some of the other variables. Does it need an access road? Does it need any type of utilities to this location? Also, remember that pumps and gates do require some redundancy and backup systems, so all of that is accounted for as well when coming up with a cost estimate. But overall, the implementation of the pumps and gate system is highly effective. We saw a reduction of close to $285 million in damage reduction for this particular storm event. So for a 100-year storm event, if it hits the entire watershed, we would see a reduction in $285 million for that one event if pumps and gates were installed. So this removes about 2,500 acres from the floodplain, and we remove close to 3,500 structures from the floodplain. In addition, it also lowers the water surface elevation for some of those homes that still flood, and those numbers are also accounted for in the damages. But what's the price tag on something like this? So the project cost is anywhere from $300 to $500 million. So looking at the damages and looking at the price tag, this is a viable project, as you could potentially see a BCA around 1, especially when we start looking at some of the smaller, more frequent recurring events. So a project like this would be one that we would suggest going further into being a more in-depth feasibility study, pre-design, environmental assessment, as well as doing a complete BCA. A project like this may seem like something that is a big undertaking, but we have seen projects like this that protect a large area and a large population density, like the city of Lake Charles, from recurring events being funded through various federal programs. So that is something to take note on. The next thing that you're going to be seeing is the similar dashboard, but I'll tell you that what we've done is we've removed the simulation just for ease of visibility for what you're going to see on the screen. So the next project that we are presenting is in the Houston River watershed. If you remember, the Houston River watershed is our largest watershed with the most laterals within it. Within that watershed, the most populated area is the DeQuincy area. And this area did have some homes that were on our repetitive loss list. So we started looking at kind of a combination of projects. One of the things that was brought forward to us was a channel improvement project. So the thing with channel improvement projects, as well as elevation of roadways or increasing the capacity of a culvert underneath a roadway, is that it moves that water. It'll quickly move that water from that area that you're trying to protect, but what it does is it just moves that water quicker downstream. So channel improvement projects are something that usually have to be completed in combination with another project. So what we did is we looked at a combination here of a channel improvement project, a large detention pond that was roughly 50 acres in size, as well as the elevation of those roadways in this area. And what we saw was it was approximately a $20 to $45 million project completed. The reduction in damages was 1.2 million. And it did remove the 56 structures that we were trying to protect, and also removes approximately 124 acres from the floodplain. But because the three projects are so expensive with very limited reduction in damages, this is a project that we wouldn't recommend going forward to the next phase. I will note that it is something that we would take to another evaluation process to look at a more localized project. So could we look at a smaller detention pond for the neighborhood that has those repetitive loss? But from a regional perspective, this project did not show us the reduction in damages related to the cost of the project that would need to be implemented in something like that. Another thing I will note when talking about a project like this is that the construction cost that we have today is pretty high. I think everybody is pretty understanding that right now we're seeing some of the highest construction costs that we've seen pretty much on record. So a project that may have a high construction cost today may be something that we want to look at and put it on the shelf, because if those construction costs come down, it could potentially allow us to move that project forward through some other funding agency. So that is something to consider. Recently, we've seen projects that have been bid out that have ranged for a detention pond between $4 and $15 million for the same project. So, a big gap within, a big spread within those construction costs as well. So our next project we're going to talk about is another pumps and gate project. This one is located in the Sulphur Watershed in the Westlake area. This project, when implemented, we saw a reduction in damages for the 100-year event of roughly $118 million. It removed 309 structures completely from the floodplain and 213 acres. Don't forget that in addition to that 309 structures, all of the homes that do flood also saw reduction, and that reduction in flood depth is also equivalent to a reduction in damages in that cost for that event. So for this project, the project cost was around $40 to $60 million, coming in at right around $45 million. So this project is something within this area that we did see had a large impact from a regional scale, and would, we believe, meet the BCA analysis to move it forward. I will note that, as Anna said, we did evaluate a lot of other projects. Some included the use of pumps and gates along other outfalls. For example, the Shoe Pick Bayou area, we did look at a pump station, and due to the flat topography of that area, we did not find this project was beneficial, because you would have had to build out an entire berm or levee system around it. So we have to take those things into account as well. So we did look at pumps and gates at other locations. Today we're just showing you two, but in general, we did see a lot of positive benefits from projects of this type for different locations. So the next one that we are going to take a look at will be in the Prion Lake watershed, and it is another detention project. So this project location was identified so that we could target roughly 2 or 3 neighborhoods that have frequent flooding as well as repetitive loss. So looking at this project, we identified the area and we ran a 100-acre detention pond. With that, we saw around $3.2 million in damages, reduction in damages for that storm event. However, a pond on the size of a 100-acre pond was between $20 and $35 million. So a project like this is one that we would say a no-go at this point, but we do believe that it is another example of where a more localized project could be looked at, or a buyout, similar to Greenwich Terrace, where we looked at different projects and didn't find a project that would reduce the damages to the level that we need, and therefore that was another alternative for that type of project. For this types of projects, we would say, hey, not moving forward at this phase, but we can look at other alternatives to help target areas like this. Um, so those are things to take into consideration. And again, that's also another type of project that it might be evaluated at another point in time when construction costs do go down as well. But our thought is that a smaller detention pond in that area would probably be more beneficial at a local level or the buyout. So the next one we're going to look at is in the Cayuchi Coulee watershed area, and it will be a detention pond. So interestingly, for me, having worked with Calcasieu Parish over the last 15 years, detention ponds been looked at throughout the Cayuchi Coulee watershed. A lot of times these ponds were looked at on the scale of like a 10 to 25 acre pond, and we didn't see much benefit, and a lot of times they were looked at very localized to where the problem areas were. So one thing that we did different this time is we started looking at detention ponds in the more upstream areas of the watershed. Can we capture that water before it even gets to these more problematic areas? So one of the things that we noted when we ran this detention pond project is that the detention pond gave us a reduction in damage of around $15 million, with the project coming in at around $20 million. So this is kind of at that point that we believe that through iterations, we could find a BCA that would be viable. Something to note here is that if you look at the red and the green numbers at the bottom, really only 124 acres were removed and 42 structures. So I know we saw some projects that had a lot more structures removed with a lot less damages. So why the difference? One thing to note is that a lot of the reduction that we saw here occurred where homes that are still going to flood in a 100-year event, but saw a reduction in that in the water depth of flooding. So that reduced their damages. This is also a great indicator that when we start looking at smaller events, that 50-year or 25-year event, homes that probably flood in these more frequent events will be completely removed as well, also increasing our BCA. So this is kind of an interesting concept here where we can't just look beforehand, as we've gone with technology and use of softwares that help us look at reduction in damages and things like that. We would have just said, oh, it only removed 42 structures. It didn't work. Well, what we're seeing now is the overall benefit of a project of this type. So from the detention pond standpoint, we've identified a couple of others within this watershed that are also beneficial. And I'll note that also in the Sulphur watershed, in the city of Sulphur area, we've also seen some ponds that have similar results that are showing some benefit, both to reducing homes from the flooded area as well as reducing the overall depth of flooding in other homes. So this is something to consider and to think about as we are progressing in moving projects forward to pre-design in that environmental phase. So the next project that we're going to talk about is in the Lake Charles project area, Lake Charles watershed area. This project is going to fall under what we're calling floodplain preservation. So this project, what we did is, you heard me mention earlier that the Lake Charles watershed is highly developed at 84%, with only 9% being vegetation and vegetated areas remaining. So one of the things we did is we looked at what would occur if an area was developed within that watershed, meeting current policy, building whatever's developed within that area, elevating it to 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So for this analysis, we looked at the Contraband Point location, which is approximately 260 acres of the remaining 1,200 acres within this watershed. We elevated all BFE +1, and we ran that 100-year event. What we saw was an increase of damages for this event of roughly $12 million. In addition, it added 315 acres to the floodplain and flooded an additional 333 structures. So something that we are talking about and suggesting is the use of floodplain preservation. So floodplain preservation can occur in multiple ways. One is we can completely preserve the other things is that it can be incorporated into a parks and recreation program. Or any development that does come in, we can look at ways that we can further preserve that floodplain. Some of these might be open foundation, open space foundations, so that the water can freely flow through that foundation structure. Other things that we can look at are larger fill mitigation elements. But the purpose of this analysis was to say, okay, we've got this last piece of property that's remaining within the shed. What is the what if? And so this is another way that we can start talking about better floodplain protection and conserving the remaining pieces of our watershed. So this is something just to consider as we move forward. So next we're going to talk about summarizing what we've heard today, what are our next steps as a parish, and also to summarize kind of some of the elements that we've talked about in our prior webinars. The next steps. We've completed this phase 1 analysis in which we did a screening. We screened projects to see which ones do we see the most benefit from and think will help us achieve a BCA that meets federal standards, as well as meet some of our other goals and objectives that we've identified as part of this watershed plan. Those projects will then move forward to that phase 2 piece. In addition, I want to remind everyone that the parish has already evaluated 21 projects through the HMGP program and selected 12 of those that did meet a BCA, and those are going to be moving forward to engineering design as well. Those projects are more of that local scale that we talked about, with smaller ponds, 10 to 25 acres in size. So that is something to also consider when looking at everything from the phasing standpoint of those projects. So where are we at from the watershed master plan? So we started off with the planning, and we explained this in our very first webinar, that we started off with planning. We did a large data collection piece. One of the things I want to note here is our survey structure inventory. Without this, we would not have been able to do those damage assessments. Evaluating the home structures within the parish is extremely important for us as that tool to be able to assess these projects. We completed that pilot study that Anna mentioned earlier, where that Dapp analysis told us to focus on not just these structural projects that we talked about today, but those non-structural elements we've talked about in previous webinars. Those models were developed, and we started to analyze and screen these projects. Right now, we're wrapping up our webinar series, and again, the intent of this webinar piece has been to get your feedback so that we're not just going to the police jury with the elements that we've seen, but feedback that we're hearing from y'all on what is the most important pieces that y'all would like the parish to focus on. And basically, we're going to wrap everything up, and we'll be presenting to the police jury near the end of the year, beginning of next year. So I want to summarize the webinars. I'd like to thank everyone who has attended the full webinar series. I know you've heard a lot of information. Sometimes it's information overload, but we really have appreciated your feedback, and we're hearing it. So some of the things I want to summarize, starting off with policy, anything that you see here that has a star next to it, these indicate things that we have heard from y'all through either the surveys or the polls that you feel are the most important to focus on. So under policy, one of those big elements was the baseline policy. Y'all want to stop looking at watershed management from a jurisdictional standpoint, but rather from a watershed standpoint and setting that baseline. Next is the BFE plus 2 feet. You've heard me state, we don't want to build a house today that we have to elevate or buy out in 50 years. So if we know that the projections for sea level rise are anywhere from 1.5 to 3 feet, we don't want to build that house 1 foot today. We want to build it higher. So let's start talking about what that means and how that can be used as better policy protection. No net fill and fill limitations. You've seen examples of projects we talked about today where if we do complete fill, what happens to that watershed? But talking about that fill limitation and how that is properly managed is extremely important to protecting the floodplain management side of conserving what volume we have within that system. And lastly, we heard a lot from y'all about development regulations. Y'all want to see growth and you want to see development within your community, but you want to ensure that whatever's coming in does not negatively impact those that currently live here. So that development standards are extremely important. And we talked about things like not only meeting pre-post conditions, but reducing the post conditions. So things like that that can be incorporated from the stormwater standpoint as well. Next, on programs, we talked about things like the community rating system. This is definitely something we heard a lot of great feedback from the constituents. They loved the fact of hearing of a program that would have incentivized them. So the more that a parish does, FEMA likes to reward those communities for going above and beyond. And you as a parish are already doing this, so getting as much credit as possible for those things that you're doing. And what that does, reduce that flood insurance premium for the homeowners themselves. The buyout program is something that's important from the parish standpoint because it gives an option for those homeowners that these projects cannot help. So sometimes that happens, that there's not a feasible project within a cost-effective standpoint. So having a buyout program beyond the federal program can be beneficial to helping these people. And we want to make sure it also incorporates that buy-in side. We don't want people to leave. We want them to stay here. Maintenance program. This is another one we heard a lot about. We want proactive maintenance, not just reactive. Y'all are getting, right now the parish is going through currently cleaning all the channels post Hurricane Laura and Delta. Y'all are going to have a great starting point. We want to keep that maintained. So implementing that program is extremely important. It also ties back to the CRS. Lastly, incentives. These again tie back to development, incentivizing where we can for either residents at the local level or developers who are coming in is extremely important. And to summarize what we talked about today, projects. You saw where pump stations and floodgates are extremely effective. They do have a large price tag, and sometimes it will take a while to get the funding and move those projects forward. But in the end, they do show great benefit and have also shown in the Dapp analysis to also have a long life. So the investment that you make today is something that will last a long duration from a project standpoint. Detention ponds are great, but one of the things I hope you've noticed is that bigger doesn't always give you more benefit. And in addition, location is another key component. Channel improvements. I know when Anna did the poll, many of you were interested in channel improvements. So channel maintenance is one thing. Channel improvements is when we widen channels or we make it have larger capacity. Again, it will move the water faster downstream. So when we do incorporate a channel improvement project, it needs to be incorporated with something in addition, like a detention pond that helps to capture that water downstream, not to hurt or negatively impact, your neighbors. So that is something that has to work with other projects. And has kind of touched on that as well, of looking at projects together, both for the positive and negative elements. And lastly, floodplain preservation. This is one that is important because the more that we can preserve these areas, the better we are going to be long term, because we are able to keep that floodplain. And whether that is through servitudes along a channel or whether that is through having complete preservation areas, these can be tied to parks and recreation. So next, a quick poll. Which webinar session did you find the most educational? The programs, policy, or projects? We hope you had the opportunity to attend all three. But we'll give everybody just a couple of seconds to do this. I know there is still a little bit of a delay, so we'll also account for that as well. Okay, it looks like people really enjoyed the webinar today, which I appreciate, especially with all the technical delays that we had. I'm really glad that the information was able to be shared and clear to everyone. Okay. Looks like 64% for projects, 27% for policy, and 9% for programs. So we'll go ahead and advance, but I know y'all see that for a second. So also, while I wait for the slides to change over due to the delay, a reminder that you can input any questions you may have into the chat box, and we will be more than happy to answer those. So where are we at right now? You heard that we're preparing everything, finalizing the consequence modeling results, which is our analysis of the 45 plus projects, and moving that forward to a master plan that can be presented to the police jury. In the meantime, and continuing, we'd like to make sure that you know that the story map is your best location for information. This is a comprehensive website that's been set up to include educational elements, resources for you from FEMA as well as other areas. But importantly, you can actually sign up so that you get notified when we update something. When is there something added to it? In addition, one of the neatest features is you can actually identify if you've ever flooded and where you're located. This isn't shared publicly, it is for internal use. And the reason we want to know this is because this will help the parish drive where problem areas are. The models are a great tool, but you, the residents, live out there and are seeing it. And again, it might even be areas that are subsurface issues or things like that, that the models don't capture, but you are seeing something in your area. So the QR codes are up here, and you can go ahead and scan those, and they'll take you to those locations, or you can visit the story map. Also, the webinars are also going to be viewable through the story map as well. So at this time, we will conclude this webinar, but we will first answer any questions that we have gotten. So I'll let Brooke kind of take the lead in reading any questions we may have.
Okay, yeah, it looks like we've gotten a couple. The first one is, what does the timeline for project funding look like?
So different types of projects will qualify for different funding sources. So there's some things that if we are doing them internal through general funds, those timelines for a detention pond can range anywhere from a year and a half to 3 years for implementation. A lot of that's due to land acquisition time as well as permitting. For larger scale projects, when we start talking about these pump stations, I'm not going to lie to you, it is going to be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. It's going to take a while to identify the location, get the funding that's needed, and the permitting. So those do have longer durations. Look, sometimes I'm surprised and projects can happen a lot quicker, but there's usually longer durations on these larger scale projects. So that is something to note.
Okay, the next one is, when will these models be available for consultants' use?
So right now, if a consultant needs any of the models for use, you can contact the parish. They are completed and calibrated, validated, and have gone through an extensive QC process. So they are available for use, not just by the parish, but you can contact them for utilization for other projects that you may have or need.
Awesome. And our last question is, what other projects would help the neighborhood shown in Creon Lake?
So for that project area, we looked at, again, regional scale. So we looked at a 100-acre pond, and the cost was way higher than the damage reduction that we saw. So one of the things that our modeler has looked at is the possibility of rerouting some of the internal drainage within a neighborhood so that it's no longer going from the neighborhood into the channel, down, and then backing into the pond, but alternatively utilizing that pond as if that pond already existed. So maybe just a 5 or 10 acre pond might be all that neighborhood needs to help relieve it. On the other side, some of those neighborhoods in that area have extensive depths of flooding, and really a project of these natures are not showing that type of impact. So it would be something more of looking at buyouts for that kind of alternative.
Okay, and that concludes our questions that we've received.
Okay, up on the screen are additional resources. As with all of our webinars, we do have a post-webinar survey that you can scan the QR code. We've gotten great feedback from everyone of how we can guide this project and move it forward. And in addition, that story map as well. We really appreciate everyone who has participated. Thank y'all and have a great day.